to go on a road tour with her. That's what made it seem like, okay, this isn't just about a broad coalition where you've got Bernie Sanders and Liz Cheney. This is the mythical voter that you're chasing.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Congressman Ro Khanna. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. The best thing you can do to help us is subscribing right here on YouTube. Thank you so much to everybody who's subscribed. It really does help a ton. Now, bipartisanship gets talked about a lot here in Washington, often in gauzy terms that harken back to a time when both parties could get together in those proverbial smoke-filled back rooms and agree on deals that didn't do too much good for average people. Now, when I hear the word bipartisanship, I often think of corruption, which is sad because there's always a need for both parties to work together. Republicans just won back the Senate, but not by much, and however the House shakes out, the majority party will have a very, very small margin once again. So getting stuff done will require some bipartisanship, and perhaps no person in Congress is in a better position to do the good kind of bipartisanship than Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat of California's 17th District. Congressman Khanna, who represents Silicon Valley, has for years known what others in the Democratic establishment just now seem to be waking up to realize. Traditional media is on the verge of being usurped by new media. Voters are now listening to and watching alternative news sources, and those news sources are worthy of politicians' time and respect. Congressman Khanna is also a policy heavyweight who's been willing to work with Republicans on some MAGA-friendly elements of industrial policy focused on working-class voters, and he also chaired Senator Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. There are few people better positioned to help Democrats regain their footing than him. So I am very happy to say that Congressman Ro Khanna joins us now. Congressman, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on, Emily.
Yeah, we were talking just before we started the recording rolling here about how it seems like so many people now are engaged in introspection on the left, and some of what I've heard over the course of the last week has sounded like what I've heard from you over the course of the last couple of years. So I want to ask if you're suddenly feeling maybe heard to a degree that you weren't before after Kamala Harris's loss, and if so, what that's been like to see so many others start to think through some of these issues that you've really been on top of for a while.
I appreciate that. I don't think it's just me. I think it's people like Bernie Sanders, people who have been saying that the divide in this country between districts like mine, which have enormous economic prosperity, and other parts of the country which have been hollowed out, where plants closed, where manufacturing left, where the NAFTA and the World Trade Organization getting China in there basically decimated working class communities. That divide is unsustainable and also having a cohesive democracy. And that what we need to do as a Democratic Party, our central mission, is to tackle that inequality, to make sure that the people who are struggling, which is the working class, but beyond the working class, probably 60-70% of Americans who think that the American dream is slipping away, that we are addressing their real justified anger at a system that for the past 50 years just has not been working for them. And then we can discuss what the differences are. And someone like Senator Sanders has policies. There's many I support. There are other ideas I have about how we build new factories, new wealth generation opportunities. But the basic premise, I think, that the mission of the party needs to be tackling this economic inequality and the sense of the decline of the American dream. That the party needs to come around to if we're going to be successful.
And one thing I've noticed just in the last week is that there seems to be an interesting war happening in the Democratic Party between people, Shannon Watts, Eddie Glaude Jr., who are blaming American voters for Kamala Harris's loss and saying the real problem wasn't the Harris campaign. It was not flawed. It was the American voters who decided to go with Donald Trump. Some people are saying it was the fault of disinformation. Michael Tomasky had a pretty viral piece about that in, I think it was the Daily Beast just the last couple of days. Disinformation flooded voters with wrong takes that made them or led them to vote for Donald Trump. And then there are people like you, like I've seen Tommy Vietor of Pod Save America, Ezra Klein, who are you're trying to think of what the Harris campaign could have done better. Which side, do you have a sense of which side is winning out? Because as an outside observer, I'm sort of concerned that the disinformation and, blaming voters side is going to win out in the end.
Well, no one can deny that race and gender are factors in American life, but they can be at our best transcended. I mean, Barack Hussein Obama transcended them in 2008 twice. Hillary Clinton, with the popular vote, transcended gender. Obviously, it would be naive to think that race and gender are not issues. But the question is, how, knowing those issues, do we give ourselves the best chance to move America towards a multiracial democracy? And at our best, our great leaders, people like Dr. King, Frederick Douglass, Ella Baker, they all believed in the possibility of transcendence, of moving past that history. And the question for the Democratic Party is, how do we do that? Not saying everything is kumbaya, but how do we do that? Now, you add to that misinformation, and I agree, that's not ideal. We're not living in a Habermasian democracy where we're all going to deliberative town halls, but we never have. I mean, today's misinformation was yesterday's. I mean, you go back to read the founders. Right. Politics was ugly. People used to talk about each other's affairs and muckraking journalism. And this has never been sort of this idealism of politics. So how do we overcome that misinformation? And my view is that by focusing on understanding people's economic pains and economic struggles and offering a vision for that, we start to build the credibility to then do things like reinstitute the fairness doctrine that would deal with some of the misinformation, or have transparency that would deal with some of the misinformation. And we build a foundation to get towards a multiracial democracy.
Do you feel like that's an uphill battle, convincing some people who are really focused on blaming voters or totally blaming disinformation, that actually there were things that Democrats could have done better to reach the working class and to talk about industrial policy and helping voters, with their bank accounts, pocketbook issues? Do you feel like that's an uphill battle right now? Because I still see some focus on, it was just the bigotry of the voters.
I think that that it's the initial stages, but ultimately, one thing about politics is people want to win, and reality is going to set in that our path to a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and to the presidency is by winning over voters in communities that didn't vote for us. And I fundamentally believe that the way to do that is to say, look, there was a great New York Times article about Chauncey, who on a podcast, and Chauncey lost his job, African-American in Milwaukee, who lost his job because of NAFTA in 2022. Master Lock shut down and sent the last remaining jobs to Mexico. And he had voted for Obama, and he had voted for Biden, but he didn't vote for Harris. How do we win those voters? You can't tell me that we lost Chauncey's vote because of race and gender. And so talking about a concrete economic vision that understands people's fear and their pain and their anger and addresses that gives us the best chance to build a majoritarian coalition. Does that mean that, there isn't going to be racism and sexism in America? Of course not. But we can build a majoritarian coalition in this country with a sharper economic, not just message, but platform.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think Democrats are in a better position than some Republicans realize right now. With 47% of the popular vote with someone like Kamala Harris, it may not have gone the right way in certain swing states, but you recently reposted a pretty smart take from Ezra Klein, who cautioned Republicans and said, quote, "Many presidencies have faltered by misreading an anti-incumbent mood as a sweeping ideological mandate." Do you think, Congressman, that your Republican colleagues are wrong for claiming an ideological mandate as they prepare to come in January?
I think they are for claiming a broad mandate. I mean, that would be a big mistake, and they'll overreach if they do that. And the appointment of someone like Tom Harman for immigration is an example of something that I think the country may recoil from if they just have mass raids in workplaces of checking people's status, as opposed to a more reasonable view of border security and immigration. But look, the flip side of the race gender question is, if you had asked me when I was growing up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania in the 1980s, that there would be an African American, Indian American woman who would be the Democratic nominee, and what percent would she get in Pennsylvania, I would have said maybe 30%. I mean, the fact that she got the 48% is pretty remarkable. And it should give hope to the party that with a stronger economic message and a stronger platform, that we can win. I mean, we're talking about 2% in 7 states.
That's a really glass half full take that I appreciate a lot. Do you think the Harris campaign should have used Liz Cheney at all? That's a super specific question, but I actually think it gets to some serious mistakes that were made on the campaign. Do you think that was just a mistake in and of itself?
I think it was a mistake to have her as prominent. I mean, look, you're building a coalition. You take most endorsements, and if she had just endorsed Vice President Harris and it was a one-day story, that's fine. But to go on a road tour with her, that's what made it seem like, okay, this isn't just about a broad coalition where you've got Bernie Sanders and Liz Cheney. This is the mythical voter that you're chasing. I mean, I think she would have been better served doing a town hall with Bernie Sanders in Michigan than with Liz Cheney, probably in Wisconsin too. So the question was, why is she emphasizing Liz Cheney and elevating her, where people are thinking that if you had asked me, well, if Kamala Harris wins, which Republican is she going to put in the cabinet? I would have said Liz Cheney. And, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Liz Cheney would be better as Secretary of State than Marco Rubio. I mean, that was the challenge that a lot of people were facing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, and that reminds me, in Milwaukee, I grew up with people like Chauncey, whose parents worked at Masterlock. And as I'm thinking through some of these issues, you wrote recently, one lesson from Tuesday's election is clear. Democrats failed to present a compelling economic vision for the working class. And when someone asked you what that might entail, you had 3 great answers. You said building modern factories in hollowed out towns, raising wages and giving workers equity, and mass apprenticeship initiatives, essentially. And I asked this question to my Republican friends on abortion. But for Democrats, do you think that these excellent, as I see them, economic policy focuses are enough to overcome what voters see as cultural gulfs? Like I said, for Republicans, a lot of it is abortion, but this issue for Democrats is trans sports, girls' locker rooms. Your colleague Seth Moulton recently had people on his staff quit. You've had really honest and I think authentic conversations with people who disagree with you on this, including Megyn Kelly. But do you think that the economic message will be enough to overcome voters in places like Milwaukee who just disagree with the Democratic Party platform on those issues, if they sense that it feels like it's part of this broader elitism on those cultural issues?
I don't think it's sufficient, but I think if we can build real economic security, economic prosperity, one lowers the bitterness and it shows people that we care and we get them. But then it has to be coupled with 2 things: authenticity in our convictions on the social issues. So I think the worst thing the Democratic Party could do as well, we did believe in trans rights, and now we should see that it only polls at 30%. So we're going to abandon that because it doesn't poll well. I mean, people don't respect a lack of conviction. But at the same time, so be authentic and then be thoughtful, civil, and reasonable. Doesn't mean that just because I believe that someone who's trans, if they're in school and they want to play sports, that inclusion value should be there. Recognize that there are values of safety that people are coming from and fairness. And while you're making the case, don't call someone a transphobe just because they may disagree with you on a particular issue. Have a reasonable conversation. So what I would say is lead with the economic vision, because that's the easiest way to unify the country. Hold true to your convictions on issues, even if they may be 30-70, because it shows that you have character and principle, that you're willing to fight for certain things, but be reasonable about those convictions and how you present them and how you disagree with people who may be coming from a different place.
Yeah, and one thing I'm hopeful about is that it won't, some of those cultural issues in the past have made it hard for Republicans and Democrats in Washington who believe in some of these populist economic policies to come together at the end of the day. So I wanted to ask you, Congressman, what areas you're sort of hopeful that if Republicans do end up with a House majority, you might be able to, and under a Trump presidency and Republican Senate, are there some areas you're looking forward to hopefully building bridges and coming to, bipartisan agreements with Republican colleagues in the next Congress?
I hold out hope and am willing to do it. The challenge is that do the policies match the rhetoric? I mean, the reality is that Biden's policies on industrialization actually financed factories and invested in unions and the workforce. Now, look, the tax debate is going to happen. One easy fix would be to say that the tax on foreign earnings for offshoring jobs should be 21%, the foreign earning tax, same as the U.S. tax. Right now it's 10%. So you're master lot, you're going to Mexico, you get to pay 10% corporate tax, whereas if you stay in Wisconsin, you pay 21%. Presumably, Donald Trump, who's talking about tariffs and making sure our factories are stop leaving, would be for raising that back up to 21%. So you're not incentivizing offshoring. If there are concrete fixes like that, they can keep our factories here, they can invest in new factories, they can invest in new science and technology. I'm open and willing to work on them. But the first Trump administration, we had a lot of the rhetoric without the follow through.
And a lot of, you know Silicon Valley very well. It's your district. And a lot of people in Silicon Valley, there was CHIPS reinvestment under the Biden administration, but Silicon Valley, even your own district, there was like I think in Santa Clara County, there was an 8-point shift towards Trump and maybe 10 points in Alameda County. Why did Silicon Valley, despite actually working okay with the Biden administration, shift towards Donald Trump? Do you have a theory on what happened there?
Some of it are local issues. I mean, there was a concern about public safety in my district and that the pendulum had swung too far for Democrats, a concern about homelessness and that we hadn't done enough to tackle it, where then Democrats control all the branches of government in California. So there was somewhat of a backlash. I mean, Governor Newsom's numbers are at best even. And so I think that some of the anger or concern about California's wanting change was reflected in Trump's numbers. And on technology people specifically, there was a view that somehow Democrats weren't championing entrepreneurs and builders. I don't agree with that, but we need to make sure that we're championing that. We want to make sure that they're taxed fairly or taxed appropriately because they've built a lot of wealth, but that we want them to be part of helping reindustrialize and build in America.
Can I ask about new media? Because this is a space where I think you've just been absolutely a leader. And I wanted to just see if you could remember when the first time is that you realized new media was going to be a powerful force that people in politics should pay attention to. Do you remember it? Like, was it a particular time? Was there something that really caught your attention? So many people are just catching up to it now.
Well, I used to do this Thom Hartmann show. It's not new media, but it was a radio show. And when I was on Bernie Sanders' campaign as a co-chair, I'd go around the country and people would say, I heard you on Hartmann. I heard you on Hartmann. And so when things came like Brianna Joy's podcast and Breaking Points and what you and Ryan Graham and others do, it was natural to me to say, look, this is a modern version of Thom Hartmann, but it actually is even reaching more and more people and we should be communicating. And invariably, because I get to travel around the country, people will say, oh, I heard you on that. I heard you on this. And what I would tell my colleagues and still do is if you go on, let's say, at Brianna Joy and you look at the comments, 70% of them will be critical of what I said, or 60% sometimes. But then when you meet the person, they'll say, well, thank you for going on. We really appreciate it. And that's what they'll remember, not the criticism. So just put yourself out there and people will respect it as long as you're saying what you really believe. I hope one of the takeaways of this is more people are going to do it. And as this interview shows, I mean, there's just a lot more you're going to get to know about someone like me than if you saw me for 7 minutes on Face the Nation. That's not because Morgan Brennan isn't a great interviewer or Face the Nation isn't a great show. It's just time constrained. And so you're going to get 7 minutes. I have to be 30 seconds on all these issues. And you can just go deeper and get a better sense of someone on these podcasts.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And that's probably the biggest question I wanted to ask you, because you've been at the forefront of this, is whether, you've said, for example, that it was a mistake for Kamala Harris not to do Joe Rogan, whether we're in a new era of politicians wherein prominent national politicians will be expected to be so authentic that they actually can sit down for a 3-hour, 2-hour, 1-hour interview with a podcaster. Bernie Sanders just did Lex Friedman. John Fetterman just did Joe Rogan. Otherwise, voters are just younger voters in particular, just going to have a sense that they can't trust you or that maybe you're a political robot or something to that effect. It seems to me that it's going to be very hard for a presidential candidate, next cycle, 2 cycles from now, to not be able to make it through a long podcast interview without just sort of being honest and chopping it up. Do you think we're in a new moment now?
I completely do. I think it's table stakes. I think you have to do Joe Rogan or the equivalent or a podcast as much as you have to do Meet the Press and Face the Nation. The irony is that I think the vice president was ducking both for too long. I mean, you got to be out there. You want to be leader of the free world. You've got to go answer the tough questions and be out there for day one and make your best case. And you have to be out there in the media. I mean, that's the best way of communicating, being challenged, refining your thinking, and having people get a sense of you. But the sad thing is, I think the vice president would have done very well. I don't get why they hit her, and it's like anything else. It's like batting practice. You do a few of them, and you get better and better and better. And in my view, it was a mistake not to have her out there from day one.
Well, that's one of the things I've been thinking of. Is this actually going to kind of change the type of politician that's able to rise to the top? I mean, are you going to have to be someone who's just more casual and less, I guess I'm trying to not say this in a way that's reflecting on Kamala Harris because I don't think it's specifically her. I think it's just we used to have a style for politicians that's going to change in the podcast era.
Yeah, I don't know if it's as much about, okay, you got to be casual and, be the person next door. I mean, obviously, to some people that's great. I think it is that you have to have a clear sense of what you're doing, why you're doing it, where you stand, and why you believe what you do. At Bernie Sanders, why did he take off? I mean, someone was joking around with me and saying, well, I picture that Bernie Sanders on the weekends is in a beat-up Volvo critiquing and cursing out billionaires and millionaires. And it's like, people have to have a sense of what's driving you. Where do you see the world going? Where do you see the country going? Why do you want to take it there? And so what I would say is that podcasts actually force you to do is to have a real world view, to answer the fundamental question of running for office, which is the why. Why are you doing this? What's your vision? Where do you want to take things? And if you're not able to do that, it becomes apparent.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way of putting it. My last question is, I know you had a relationship with Mike Waltz and other people. You're familiar with other people that Donald Trump has made big appointments already to his cabinet and to his administration. One of the horseshoe areas that we've seen among the populist left and right is on foreign policy, where there's been some agreement, not broad agreement on everything, but some agreement on different issues. Do you have a take so far on whether Donald Trump is delivering for the voters that are sort of skeptical of what's denounced as the uniparty foreign policy in D.C. so far? Do you think he's delivering on that, or do you agree with some people on the left? Kyle Kulinski is one person in new media, particularly that I'm thinking of already, who have said this is Michael Tracy as well. This is a joke. Like, this is just Donald Trump going back to the neoconservative foreign policy of the Republican Party. Are you still hopeful that there might be some genuine populism on this issue under a Trump administration based on the appointments?
Well, I think Colin's right that Rubio doesn't reflect the more restrained view of military intervention, and I think he was affiliated with the neocon movement prior to 2016 and in his presidential run. But, look, I'm not going to make a judgment before we even have day one. The question is, what are the policies going to be on a two-state solution in Gaza? Is he really going to seek to end the war there and get the hostages out and work towards a Palestinian state? Is he really going to try to bring a just peace in Ukraine? What is his posture going to be towards not getting into another Middle East war? My hope is that we're not going to make some of the colossal mistakes we made in the Bush administration, and that we're going to avoid that kind of zealous intervention. But I can understand why someone like Kyle is saying, well, you put Rubio as Secretary of State. At the end of the day, though, it's the president who calls the shots. I realized this when I was critical of the policy of the Biden administration in Israel and Gaza, and ultimately it's the president's decision. So, we'll see where Donald Trump lands.
Congressman Ro Khanna, you are very busy this week. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. Always enjoy being on. Hope to be back.
It was really great to have an opportunity to kind of talk through some of this with Congressman Khanna now that we are a week from the presidential election results becoming clear. So he has some very, very interesting points, some issues that we definitely disagree on, but I think he is, like I said earlier, in a better position to help Democrats regain their footing. And just a quick point on that, as a conservative, I look at the numbers from last week and see Kamala Harris is at about 47% of the popular vote. That could change. It could actually get higher as California is still counting votes, to just mention one state. But that's a lot of the country who voted for Kamala Harris, who I see as not a particularly strong candidate. Despite all of her weaknesses as a candidate, she still managed to get 47% of the country to vote for her. Her margin of defeat in swing states was small. She lost Pennsylvania by about 3 points, pretty significant. But in other states, Michigan, Wisconsin, she had a much smaller margin of defeat. So all that is to say, there are a lot of people in the American public who agree more with the Democratic Party on issues like abortion, on tax hikes for the wealthy and for corporations, on gay marriage. There are a lot of people in the country, most people in the country agree more with Democrats on those issues than they do with Republicans. So if Democrats can do some of what Congressman Khanna just laid out, Republicans probably are celebrating this mandate that Trump has claimed in a way that could, as we talked about and Ezra Klein mentioned, be an overreach, politically an overreach. I'm not talking about any of this from a policy standpoint, but just merely a political overreach. So it's a lot for Republicans to think about. And there actually is a total glass half full way to look at this and say, really, this is a moment for Democrats to rebuild in a way that's a lot healthier for them, that makes their party a lot more appealing. Now, as I mentioned, Congressman Seth Moulton had some of his top aides resign because he posted a pretty anodyne point that most of the country would agree with on women's sports, just that he doesn't think boys should be playing in girls' sports. Essentially, he said he had daughters. He doesn't want boys playing in girls' sports. And he had staffers quit over that. He's gotten a lot of backlash over that. So can Democrats find a way to level with voters and sort of close some of those cultural gaps to make their economic pitch? So first of all, they have to make that economic pitch. And second of all, they have to couple it, as Ro Khanna said just now on the show, with the economic policy to, quote, lower the bitterness. That's one of the points he just made, I think, really eloquently. That's an open question. But if they can, that would make the Democratic Party very powerful. And Republicans would have to grapple with some of the baggage that having Donald Trump at the top of the ticket allows them to paper over. So, anti-populism on certain economic policies, the social safety net, sort of establishment foreign policy beliefs. All of that, I think, would bubble to the surface if Democrats got their act together in a way that Republicans would then have to grapple with. So thank you so much for tuning in today. The most helpful thing you could do is to subscribe right here to the Undercurrents channel. If you want to listen to this as a podcast, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and go over to undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. You get all kinds of stuff with Unheard and a full episode at least once a week that is just for premium subscribers. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back here tomorrow with more Undercurrents.